The Bourneville Village Green still sits at the centre of Birmingham's south side. Neat hedgerows line streets where factory workers once walked to morning shifts. The houses have gardens. The cricket pitch is mowed. There are no pubs because the man who built this place believed alcohol destroyed families. For almost 2 centuries, Cadbury was more than a chocolate company. It was a moral argument made in cocoa and brick. Quaker founders who believed business was a form of worship built an empire that fed nations and housed thousands. Today, the chocolate tastes different. The factory runs lean. The name belongs to an American conglomerate most consumers cannot identify. How does a company built on conscience get swallowed by a company built on leverage? As we dive into the rise and fall of this giant, I want to hear from you. Which legendary company or forgotten factory would you like to see in our next investigation? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more stories of industrial empires and the business decisions that changed the course of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. John Cadbury opened a shop at 93 Bull Street in Birmingham in 1824. He was 22 years old, a Quaker from a family that had been in the city for generations, and he sold tea, coffee, and a product that most of his customers had never tasted: drinking chocolate. The shop was small, respectable, and deliberate. Everything about it reflected the man who ran it. Cadbury didn't drink alcohol. He didn't gamble. He believed, with the conviction that only deep religious faith can produce, that the working poor of Birmingham were being destroyed not by laziness or moral failure, but by gin. The taverns that lined every street in the city's industrial quarters were killing machines. Men drank their wages. Women drank to endure what the men brought home. The children grew up in households where violence and poverty fed on each other in endless loops. Cadbury's answer was chocolate. Not the luxury confection we think of today, but a thick, bitter, hot drink made from ground cocoa beans. It was nourishing. It was warm. And critically, it wasn't alcohol. He positioned drinking chocolate as a virtuous alternative, a temperance beverage that could replace the pint without leaving a family destitute. The Quaker framework mattered here. Understanding it is essential to understanding everything that followed. Quakers in early 19th century England occupied a peculiar social position. They were barred from attending Oxford or Cambridge. They couldn't hold public office. Many professions were closed to them, so they poured their intelligence, their discipline, and their relentless moral energy into the one arena that remained open: commerce. But Quaker commerce was different. It operated on principles that most businessmen of the era would have found bizarre: fixed prices, no haggling, honest weights and measures, fair dealing with suppliers, the belief that a transaction should benefit both parties equally. And underneath all of it, a conviction that wealth was not an end in itself, but a tool for social improvement. Business was stewardship. Profit was responsibility. God was watching the ledger. This philosophy produced an extraordinary cluster of British companies: the Rowntrees in York, the Frys in Bristol, the Cadburys in Birmingham, all Quaker families, all in chocolate. All driven by the same fusion of faith and enterprise that made them simultaneously progressive employers and fierce competitors. John Cadbury's shop did well enough. He expanded into manufacturing, opening a small factory on Crooked Lane in 1831 to roast and grind cocoa beans. He obtained a royal warrant in 1854, becoming an official supplier to Queen Victoria. On paper, the business looked solid. In reality, it was struggling. Here's the thing about chocolate manufacturing in the mid-19th century. Almost nobody was making a pure product. Cocoa beans were expensive. The extraction process was crude. To stretch their margins, manufacturers across Britain adulterated their cocoa with starch, potato flour, sago, even brick dust. The resulting drink was gritty, heavy, and bore little resemblance to what we'd recognize as chocolate today. Cadbury's products were no exception. Despite his Quaker principles about honest dealing, the company sold cocoa that was cut with fillers just like everyone else's. The economics demanded it. Pure cocoa couldn't compete on price with adulterated versions, and consumers who had never tasted the real thing didn't know what they were missing. By the late 1850s, John Cadbury's health was failing. The business was barely profitable. Competition from larger manufacturers like Fry's was intensifying. The factory on Crooked Lane was cramped, outdated, and increasingly inadequate. John had lost his first wife, Candia, in 1855, and the grief hollowed him out. He married again, but the energy that had driven him to open that shop on Bull Street 3 decades earlier was spent. In 1861, he handed the business to his sons. Richard was 25, George was 22. The same age John had been when he started. The company they inherited was essentially dying. The factory employed fewer than 20 workers. Sales were declining. The product line was uninspired. Debts were mounting. Richard and George Cadbury took over a business that most reasonable observers would have closed, sold the equipment, and walked away from. They didn't. What they did instead was examine the entire operation with the ruthless clarity that desperation produces. They worked the factory floor themselves, arriving before dawn and staying after the last worker left. They studied every process, every cost, every product, and they identified the fundamental problem. The chocolate was bad. Not bad by the standards of the industry. Bad absolutely. Adulterated, gritty, heavy cocoa that tasted like a compromise because that's exactly what it was. The brothers made a decision that would define the next century of the company's history. They would make pure chocolate. No fillers, no adulterants, no compromises. The tool that made this possible arrived from Holland. The Van Houten cocoa press, invented by Coenraad Johannes van Houten decades earlier, could separate cocoa butter from the cocoa mass far more efficiently than traditional methods. The result was a lighter, smoother powder that dissolved cleanly in hot liquid. In 1866, Richard and George launched Cadbury's Cocoa Essence. The marketing was as revolutionary as the product. They advertised it as absolutely pure, therefore best. That word, pure, was a weapon aimed directly at every competitor selling adulterated slop. It was also a moral claim wrapped in a commercial one. Purity of product reflected purity of purpose. Quaker honesty made tangible in a cup of cocoa. The market responded slowly at first, then accelerating. Cocoa Essence found customers among the growing middle class who could taste the difference and were willing to pay for it. The product won medals at exhibitions. Sales climbed. By the early 1870s, the brothers had stabilized the business and begun generating real profit for the first time in decades. But Richard and George Cadbury weren't interested in merely surviving. They looked at their cramped factory in central Birmingham, surrounded by slums and smoke and the same taverns their father had railed against 40 years earlier, and they saw everything wrong with industrial England concentrated in a single view. The workers who made their chocolate lived in back-to-back houses with no gardens, no light, no space to breathe. They walked to work through streets that stank of sewage. Their children played in alleyways. The air they breathed was thick with coal smoke from 100 factory chimneys. The brothers began to imagine something different. Not just a new factory, but an entirely new way of organizing the relationship between work and life. They started looking for land outside the city. Somewhere with clean air, open space, and room to build not just a manufacturing operation, but a community. They found it 4 miles south of Birmingham, along the railway line to Bristol. 14.5 acres of meadow and farmland in a place that barely qualified as a village. The brothers called it Bourneville. They bought the land in 1879, and with that purchase, they set in motion the most ambitious experiment in industrial welfare that England had ever seen. George Cadbury stood on that empty farmland and saw what Samuel Colt had seen when he looked at the Connecticut river meadows decades earlier. A blank canvas for an industrial vision. But where Colt saw control, Cadbury saw liberation. Where Colt built a company town designed to keep workers productive and compliant, Cadbury planned something genuinely different. A place where the factory existed to serve the community, not the other way around. Whether he could sustain that distinction across generations and ownership changes was a question that wouldn't be answered for over a century. The answer, when it came, would be devastating. The construction of Bournville began in 1879, and from the first brick laid, it was clear that George Cadbury was building something that had no precedent in English industrial life. The factory came first. A modern manufacturing facility designed around principles that would have baffled most factory owners of the era. Natural light. Every workroom had large windows, floor to ceiling where possible, because George believed that sunlight was not a luxury, but a necessity for human health. Ventilation systems pulled fresh air through the building. The floors were clean. The machinery was maintained. Separate facilities for men and women included changing rooms, dining halls, and kitchens where workers could heat meals they brought from home. But the factory was only the beginning. George Cadbury's vision extended far beyond the shop floor. He looked at the slums his workers had left behind in central Birmingham and decided that housing was not a private matter to be left to landlords and market forces. It was an industrial responsibility. If you expected people to build your product with care and precision, you owed them a life worth living outside the factory gates. The first houses went up along tree-lined streets that George himself helped design. Each home had a front garden and a back garden, a minimum standard he insisted upon because he believed that growing things, tending soil, watching plants come up was essential to mental health. No back-to-back terraces, no shared walls on three sides, no cramped courtyards where children played in shadow. Every house faced open air and green space. The contrast with what these workers had known in Birmingham's industrial core was staggering. Here's the thing about George Cadbury. He wasn't performing generosity, he was executing a philosophy. The Quaker conviction that every human being carried a divine spark meant that degrading living conditions weren't just unfortunate, they were sinful. A factory owner who profited from labor while allowing his workers to live in squalor was committing a moral offense, not against society in the abstract, but against God specifically. This wasn't charity, it was obligation. The village grew steadily through the 1880s and 90s. Schools appeared, a meeting house for worship, playing fields for cricket and football, swimming baths, open parkland where families could walk on Sundays, and conspicuously, deliberately, there were no pubs, not one. The Cadburys' temperance convictions ran deep, and Bournville was their proving ground. If you could build a community without alcohol and demonstrate that workers thrived without it, you had an argument that could reshape national policy. The absence of pubs was not a minor detail, it was a statement of purpose etched into the village plan. By 1895, the Bournville estate had grown to include over 300 houses, and George Cadbury made a decision that separates him from almost every other industrial paternalist in history. He could have kept the village as company property, a tool for retaining workers and controlling behavior the way Samuel Colt had done in Hartford. Instead, in 1900, he established the Bournville Village Trust. He transferred 313 houses and 330 acres of land into an independent charitable trust that would manage the village permanently, free from any connection to the Cadbury Company. Let that sink in. He gave it away. Not to his children, not to the shareholders, not to the company. To the community itself, held in trust by an independent board that the Cadbury family could influence but never control. The trust's founding deed specified that the village must always provide housing for working people at affordable rents. that the gardens must be maintained, that the open spaces must be preserved. George Cadbury built his utopia and then deliberately removed his own ability to destroy it. Inside the factory, the Cadburys were pioneering working conditions that wouldn't become legal requirements for decades. Workers received Saturday half-holidays long before they were standard. The company introduced pension schemes, sickness benefits, and medical care provided by company doctors at no cost to employees. Evening classes offered education in everything from literature to woodworking. Sports teams competed in company leagues. Annual outings took entire departments to the countryside. Picture this: a factory in the 1890s where workers clocked off at reasonable hours, walked home through tree-lined streets to houses with gardens, sent their children to well-funded schools, and received medical care when they fell ill. In an era when 12-hour shifts, child labor, and industrial disease were normal, Bournville operated on principles that most of Britain wouldn't adopt for another 50 years. The cynical reading is that this was simply efficient management dressed in moral clothing. Happy workers produce more, healthy workers miss fewer shifts, loyal workers don't unionize, and there's truth in that. George Cadbury was not running a charity. He was running a business, and the business was thriving precisely because the workforce was stable, skilled, and motivated. But reducing Bournville to mere calculation misses something essential. George Cadbury spent his own personal fortune on the village, money that could have gone to his family or his shareholders. He gave away assets worth millions in today's terms with no expectation of return. He campaigned publicly for housing reform and labor protections that would benefit his competitors' workers as much as his own. The man was a capitalist, certainly, but he was a capitalist who genuinely believed that capitalism without conscience was a machine for producing misery. Richard Cadbury, the older brother, died in 1899. He had been the quieter partner, focused on production and product development, while George handled the social vision. His death left George as the sole driving force behind both the company and the community. George carried both burdens into the new century with the same energy he had brought to the failing business 40 years earlier. The factory expanded. New buildings went up along the rail line. The workforce grew into the hundreds, then the thousands. The product line evolved from cocoa powder into solid chocolate bars, chocolate assortments, and the increasingly elaborate boxes of confections that would become synonymous with the Cadbury name. The machinery modernized, the processes refined. What had been a struggling family operation was becoming a national institution. And George Cadbury, now in his 60s, began looking beyond Bournville for ways to amplify the moral argument his village represented. He believed that the press was the most powerful tool for social reform available. In 1901, he purchased the Daily News, a London newspaper that he transformed into a platform for progressive causes. The paper campaigned against sweated labor, the system of subcontracting that allowed manufacturers to exploit workers in unregulated home workshops. It exposed slum conditions. It opposed the Boer War. George used his chocolate fortune to buy a megaphone and aimed it at the conscience of the nation. Here's the kicker. The same moral conviction that made Cadbury great would eventually make it vulnerable. A company built on Quaker principles of fair dealing and honest conduct was a company that didn't think in terms of hostile defense strategies. A family that believed business should serve community rather than extract from it was a family that would struggle to survive in a world where corporations existed solely to maximize shareholder value. But that reckoning was still decades away. In the early 1900s, Cadbury stood at the peak of its moral and commercial authority. The factory hummed, the village flourished. The brand meant something beyond chocolate. It meant decency itself. And the family that built it all believed, with the quiet certainty of people who have never been truly tested, that what they had created would endure because it deserved to endure. They were wrong about that. Deserving has never been enough. The product that transformed Cadbury from a respected regional manufacturer into a national institution arrived in 1905. Dairy milk. The name was plain, almost aggressively simple, and that was the point. George Cadbury understood something about the British consumer that his competitors kept missing. People didn't want exotic, they wanted trustworthy. They wanted a chocolate bar that tasted the same every time, that their children could recognize by the wrapper, that carried an implicit promise of quality, backed by a name they already associated with decency. Dairy milk delivered on all of it. The formula was straightforward: more milk than any competing product, a higher ratio of fresh cream milk to cocoa solids that produced a creamier, sweeter, smoother bar than anything on the British market. With the recipe, used a glass and a half of full cream milk in every half-pound of chocolate, a ratio that Cadbury would turn into one of the most recognizable advertising lines in British commercial history. The bar wasn't sophisticated. French chocolatiers would have dismissed it as pedestrian. Swiss manufacturers like Lindt and Tobler were producing products of far greater complexity. But dairy milk wasn't competing with the Swiss. It was competing for the pocket money of every working-class family in Britain, and on that battlefield it was devastating. Sales climbed steadily through the first decade of the 20th century. By 1913, dairy milk had become the company's best-selling product, overtaking the cocoa powder that had saved the business 40 years earlier. The purple wrapper, a color chosen because it was associated with royalty and quality, became as recognizable as any flag. Cadbury wasn't just selling chocolate anymore, it was selling identity. To buy a Cadbury bar was to participate in something wholesome, something British, something that connected the customer to the model village and the Quaker values and the whole moral apparatus that the family had spent decades constructing. Here's the thing about building a brand on values: it works brilliantly as long as the values are genuine. Cadbury's reputation wasn't manufactured by an advertising agency. It grew organically from decades of actual behavior. The houses in Bourneville were real. The workers' pensions were real. The gardens and the schools and the medical care were real. When Cadbury claimed to be a company that cared about people, our consumers believed it because the evidence was visible to anyone who bothered to look. The factory at Bourneville expanded relentlessly to meet demand. New production halls went up along the railway line. Specialized departments handled every stage of the process, from roasting raw cocoa beans to wrapping finished bars. The workforce swelled past 2,000, then 3,000, then kept climbing. Each new employee entered an ecosystem designed to make industrial labor bearable and sometimes even dignified. But the system needed people to run it, and one man mattered more than any other. William Adlington Cadbury, George's nephew, took charge of the company's cocoa sourcing in the early 1900s and walked straight into a scandal that tested Quaker principles against commercial reality. Reports emerged that cocoa from the Portuguese colony of São Tomé was being harvested by enslaved laborers. William traveled to West Africa personally to investigate. What he found confirmed the worst. Cadbury was buying cocoa produced by forced labor. The family faced a choice that would have destroyed lesser companies: continue purchasing cheap cocoa and betray everything they claimed to stand for, or cut the supply chain and absorb crippling costs. William pushed for a boycott of São Tomé cocoa. The company eventually complied, switching to suppliers in the Gold Coast, where conditions, while far from perfect, did not involve outright slavery. The transition cost the company significant money and disrupted production for months. George Cadbury backed his nephew completely. Profit could not be built on chains. That was the line. And the family held it. The First World War tested Bourneville in ways that peacetime never had. The factory shifted to wartime production, manufacturing not just chocolate for soldiers' rations, but equipment and supplies for the military effort. Thousands of Bourneville workers enlisted. A young foreman named Edward Thackeray, who had started in the moulding room at 16, joined the Warwickshire Regiment in 1915 and was killed at the Somme the following year. His name went on the Departmental Honour Board alongside dozens of others. The company maintained the jobs of every enlisted man and paid allowances to their families during service. Gold stars accumulated. The village absorbed the grief quietly, the way Quaker communities absorbed everything, with prayer and practical support and an absolute refusal to make spectacle of suffering. Between the wars, a new generation of Cadbury managers shaped the company's expansion. Lawrence Cadbury, George's son, became chairman in 1922 after his father's death at 83. Lawrence was quieter than George, more cautious, a consolidator rather than a visionary. But he understood that the empire his father had built needed professional management to sustain its growth. He hired industrial chemists who improved chocolate tempering processes. He brought in production engineers who redesigned factory layouts for efficiency. He oversaw the launch of products that extended the brand into new occasions. Rose's assortments in 1938. Whole nut. Fruit and nut. Each one became a fixture in British households, given at Christmas, shared at cinemas, tucked into lunchboxes by mothers who trusted the purple wrapper as instinctively as they trusted their own kitchens. Here's the kicker. Lawrence Cadbury maintained his father's values while modernizing the operation, but the balance was precarious. Every professional manager he hired brought expertise the company needed and priorities the founders would not have recognized. Accountants measured performance in returns on capital. Marketing. Executives thought in terms of market share. Production engineers optimized for output per labor hour. None of these metrics were wrong. All of them were incomplete. The Quaker framework that George Cadbury had embedded in every brick of Bourneville didn't appear on any balance sheet. It lived in the culture, in the assumptions people made about how decisions should be weighted, in the habits of conscience that decades of family leadership had normalized. Culture is powerful. It is also fragile. It persists only as long as the people who carry it remain in charge. By the late 1930s, Cadbury employed over 7,000 workers at Bourneville alone, with additional factories in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India. The sun never set on Cadbury chocolate. The company had become everything George Cadbury dreamed it could be. An empire built on sweetness and conviction, stretching across continents, employing tens of thousands, feeding millions. And at its center, the village still stood. The gardens still bloomed. The cricket pitch was mowed every week. No pubs disturbed the peace. But the man who had planted those gardens and banned those pubs was gone. And the question that his death had left unanswered was growing louder with each passing decade. Could the conscience of one family survive inside a corporation that was outgrowing the family's ability to control it? The answer was already forming, slowly, in the gap between what Cadbury meant and what Cadbury measured. Nobody heard it yet. They would. The force that Cadbury could no longer withstand arrived in 1969, wearing a business suit and carrying a merger proposal. Schweppes. The drinks company, founded in Geneva in 1783, famous for its tonic water and carbonated beverages, approached Cadbury with a proposition that would have made George Cadbury reach for his Bible: a merger of equals. Two great British brands joining forces to create a diversified food and beverage conglomerate capable of competing on the global stage. The logic looked compelling on paper. Cadbury had chocolate, Schweppes had drinks. Together, they could share distribution networks, pool marketing resources, and present a united front against the American and European giants that were consolidating the global food industry. The Cadbury family was still represented on the board, but no longer dominant in daily operations, agreed. In 1969, Cadbury Schweppes was born. Here's the thing about mergers of equals: they never are. One culture always dominates, and the culture that dominates is usually the one less burdened by moral commitments. Schweppes brought a commercial aggressiveness that the Quaker-founded chocolate company had never cultivated. Profit targets tightened, marketing budgets expanded. The language of the boardroom shifted from stewardship and community to shareholder value and return on capital employed. The Bournville factory still hummed. The village trust still maintained its gardens. But inside the corporate structure, the priorities were rotating like a compass needle swinging away from true north. The 1970s and 80s were decades of drift. The Cadbury Schweppes expanded aggressively through acquisitions, buying brands across the food and beverage spectrum. They purchased Thai Food Tea, the Kenko coffee brand, and a string of soft drink companies. The conglomerate grew larger but less coherent. Each acquisition added revenue and complexity, while diluting the identity that had once made Cadbury distinctive. The company that George Cadbury built to prove that business could serve moral purposes was becoming a holding company that existed to serve financial ones. Nobody announced this transformation. It happened in quarterly reports and board presentations, in the gradual replacement of family values with fiduciary duties, in the slow substitution of stakeholder thinking for shareholder thinking. The family's retreat from operational control accelerated through these decades. Cadbury descendants still sat on the board, still held shares, still cared about the legacy. But caring about a legacy and controlling a corporation are fundamentally different activities. The professional managers who ran daily operations answered to financial metrics, not to Quaker principles. They were competent people doing their jobs as their training and incentives demanded. The problem was structural, not personal. A publicly traded corporation with dispersed ownership cannot sustain a founder's moral vision indefinitely. The mechanisms of governance pull in one direction. The memory of conscience pulls in another. Eventually, one of them wins. Let that sink in. The very act of going public, which the Cadbury family had done decades earlier to raise capital for expansion, had planted the seed of their eventual dispossession. A public ownership meant that anyone could buy shares. Anyone included people who cared nothing about Bournville, nothing about Quaker values, nothing about the model village or the workers' pensions or the gardens that George Cadbury had believed were essential to human dignity. Shares were just numbers on a screen. They could be accumulated, traded, weaponized. The family had opened a door they could never close. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Cadbury Schweppes continued its strategy of growth through acquisition. They bought Adams, the American gum and candy company, for nearly $5 billion in 2003. They expanded into emerging markets. Revenue grew. The stock price performed respectably. But the conglomerate structure was increasingly unwieldy. Key analysts on the City of London and Wall Street began pressing for a breakup. The argument was simple and ruthless. A focused confectionery company would be valued more highly by the market than a diversified food and beverage group. Separate the chocolate from the tonic water and both pieces would be worth more than the whole. In 2007, the board agreed. Cadbury would demerge from Schweppes, spinning off the beverages business and emerging as a standalone confectionery company. The decision was presented as strategic clarity. Focus on what you do best. Become a pure-play chocolate and candy manufacturer. The financial press applauded. Here's the kicker. The demerger, completed in 2008, accomplished exactly what the analysts wanted. It created a focused, profitable, well-branded confectionery company with operations in 60 countries and sales of over £5 billion annually. It also created a target. A standalone Cadbury was smaller than Cadbury Schweppes had been. It lacked the diversification that had made a hostile takeover complicated and expensive. Its share register was dispersed. Its defenses were minimal. The Cadbury family's ownership stake had been diluted through decades of share issuance until it represented a fraction of total equity. The company that George Cadbury had built was now a prize sitting in an open field, protected by nothing except its reputation and the assumption that British institutions would defend a British icon. That assumption was about to be tested. In boardrooms across the Atlantic, executives at Kraft Foods, or the American food conglomerate headquartered in Northfield, Illinois, had been watching Cadbury for years. Kraft was enormous, a $60 billion operation that sold everything from Philadelphia cream cheese to Oreo cookies to Oscar Mayer hot dogs. It was also struggling. Revenue growth had stalled. The stock price was flat. CEO Irene Rosenfeld needed a transformative acquisition to restart the company's momentum, and Cadbury, with its powerful brands and its exposure to fast-growing markets in India and Latin America, looked like exactly the answer. Rosenfeld began assembling the financing. Kraft would use a combination of cash, new debt, and the sale of its pizza business to fund the bid. The numbers were enormous. The strategy was straightforward. Buy Cadbury, strip the costs, capture the brands, or use the emerging market distribution network to sell Kraft products where Cadbury already had relationships. It was corporate acquisition logic in its purest form. Financial engineering applied to a century of moral engineering. The spreadsheets didn't have a column for Quaker values. They didn't have a row for community impact. They had revenue projections, cost synergies, and a target price per share that would make the deal accretive to Kraft's earnings within 18 months. By the summer of 2009, Rosenfeld was ready. The bid that would end the Cadbury story as its founders understood it was about to begin. And the defenses that a Quaker family might have built, the poison pills, the dual-class share structures, the golden shares that other European companies used to protect themselves from exactly this kind of predation, did not exist. The Cadburys had never imagined they would need them. Fair dealing, honest negotiation, the belief that reasonable people could always reach agreement. These principles had built an empire. They had not built a fortress. On September 7, 2009, Kraft Foods made its move. The company announced an unsolicited bid to acquire Cadbury for £10 billion, roughly 745 pence per share. The offer landed like a grenade in British corporate life. Cadbury's board, chaired by Roger Carr, rejected it within hours. The bid fundamentally undervalued the company, they said. Cadbury was not for sale. The response was firm, public, and in hindsight, completely inadequate for what was coming. Because Kraft had not made a casual inquiry, Irene Rosenfeld had spent months preparing this assault, lining up financing, briefing analysts, building the narrative that Cadbury was an underperforming asset waiting to be optimized. The initial bid was low by design. It was an opening position, not a final offer. Everyone in the City of London understood this, except perhaps the people who still believed that a company's heritage should count for something in a takeover fight. Roger Carr mounted a defense. He argued publicly that Cadbury's standalone strategy would deliver more value than Kraft's offer. He pointed to the company's growth in emerging markets, its strong brand portfolio, its improving margins. The financial case was sound. Cadbury was performing well. Its stock had been climbing before Kraft's approach. The bid wasn't rescuing a failing company. It was raiding a successful one. Carr took his argument to the press, to Parliament, to anyone who would listen. The British public, it turned out, was listening intently. The prospect of Cadbury falling to an American food conglomerate struck a nerve that surprised even the defenders. But this wasn't just a corporate transaction, it was a cultural assault. Letters flooded newspapers. Members of Parliament demanded government intervention. Trade unions organized protests outside Cadbury's London offices. The company that George Cadbury had built as a moral argument had become, in its hour of crisis, a symbol of everything Britain feared about globalization. The sale of Cadbury meant the loss of something that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. Identity, heritage, The belief that some institutions should be protected from the logic of pure financial extraction. Here's the thing about hostile takeovers. Sentiment doesn't vote, shares do. And the structure of Cadbury's share register was the company's fatal vulnerability. Decades of public trading had dispersed ownership across thousands of institutional investors, pension funds, hedge funds, and individual shareholders. The Cadbury family's stake had been diluted to insignificance. The people who actually controlled the company's fate were fund managers in London, New York, and Hong Kong who held Cadbury shares as line items in diversified portfolios. They didn't care about Bournville. They didn't care about Quaker values. They cared about one thing: the price per share, and Kraft kept raising it. Through the autumn and winter of 2009, the bid crept upward. Kraft revised its offer, sweetened the terms, adjusted the mix of cash and shares. Each revision was calibrated to peel away another layer of resistance. Hedge funds, smelling profit, began buying Cadbury shares in enormous volumes. These were arbitrageurs, traders who specialize in takeover situations, buying shares at the current market price and betting that the final acquisition price would be higher. They had no interest in Cadbury's future. They had no interest in its past. They wanted the spread between the purchase price and the takeover premium, and they wanted it quickly. By December 2009, short-term investors controlled a significant portion of Cadbury's shares. The long-term holders who might have rejected Kraft's offer on principle were being outvoted by speculators who would accept any price above their entry point. Let that sink in. The fate of a company that had been built over nearly 2 centuries by a family that believed business was a form of worship was being decided by traders who had held the shares for weeks. The mechanism was perfectly legal. It was also perfectly destructive. British takeover rules, governed by the Takeover Panel, required that once Kraft had secured acceptances from holders of 90% of shares, the remaining holdouts could be compulsorily acquired. The rules were designed to prevent minority shareholders from blocking transactions that the majority supported. In practice, they meant that once the arbitrageurs had accumulated enough shares, the outcome was inevitable. Kraft made its final offer on January 19, 2010. 840 pence per share, nearly £12 billion for the entire company. Roger Carr and the Cadbury board, facing arithmetic they could not overcome, recommended acceptance. The board had fought for 4 months. They had extracted a higher price. They had forced Kraft to pay more than Rosenfeld had wanted to spend. But they had lost the war. Cadbury, founded by a Quaker grocer in 1824, built into a national institution by men who believed that profit and principle were inseparable, would now belong to the makers of Velveeta cheese and Oscar Mayer wieners. The announcement landed with the weight of a funeral notice. Workers at Bournville described hearing the news on the factory floor, the machines still running, the chocolate still flowing through the tempering lines, while their future was being signed away in a London boardroom. Union representatives expressed anger that bordered on grief. Politicians who had promised to protect Cadbury admitted they had no legal mechanism to stop the sale. The Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, called it disappointing. That word, disappointing, captured the impotence perfectly. The entire British establishment had watched one of its most beloved companies get absorbed by an American conglomerate, and the most powerful response anyone could muster was disappointment. Here's the kicker. During the takeover battle, Kraft had made a specific public promise. The company's Somerdale factory near Keynsham in Somerset, which Cadbury had already announced plans to close as part of its own restructuring, would be kept open under Kraft ownership. Rosenfeld's team stated this explicitly. Somerdale would remain operational, jobs would be preserved. It was presented as evidence of Kraft's commitment to Cadbury's heritage and workforce, a reassurance designed to soften opposition during the most contentious phase of the bid. The promise was made in November 2009. When Kraft needed every argument it could find to persuade wavering shareholders and placate hostile politicians. It served its purpose, it helped close the deal, and it was a lie. Within weeks of completing the acquisition in February 2010, Kraft announced that Summerdale would close after all. 400 workers would lose their jobs. The production lines would be moved to Poland, where labor was cheaper and unions were weaker. The promise that had helped Kraft win the takeover was discarded the moment it was no longer useful. Nobody who understood corporate acquisitions was surprised. Everybody who had trusted the promise was devastated. The British Parliament summoned Irene Rosenfeld to explain herself. She refused to come. The CEO of Kraft Foods, the woman who had just acquired one of Britain's most cherished companies using a promise she had already broken, declined the invitation of the House of Commons Business Select Committee to testify about the Summerdale closure. She sent a subordinate instead. Mark Firestone, Kraft's general counsel, sat before the committee and absorbed the fury of MPs who wanted to know how a commitment made during a takeover battle could evaporate within weeks of completion. The answer, stripped of corporate language, was simple. The promise had served its purpose. It had neutralized political opposition long enough for the deal to close. Once the shares were acquired, once the ownership transferred, once the legal paperwork was filed, the promise became worthless. There was no enforcement mechanism, no penalty for breaking it, no regulatory body with the authority to hold Kraft accountable for statements made during a bid process. The takeover panel governed the financial conduct of acquisitions, not the honesty of operational commitments. Kraft had exploited a gap in the system that everyone knew existed, but nobody had bothered to close. The Summerdale closure proceeded exactly as Kraft had planned before the takeover began. 400 jobs disappeared. Production lines were dismantled and shipped to a facility in Skarbimierz, Poland, where workers earned a fraction of British wages and labor protections were thinner. Families in Keynsham who had worked at the factory for generations found themselves unemployed, their skills specific to an industry that had just left their town. The local economy absorbed the blow the way small towns always absorb these blows, quietly and without recovery. Shops lost customers, housing prices softened. The community that had grown around the factory contracted like a living thing, losing circulation to its extremities. But Summerdale was only the beginning. What followed was the systematic transformation of Cadbury from a company with a soul into a brand on a spreadsheet. In 2012, Kraft split itself into two companies. The grocery business retained the Kraft name. The snacks and confectionery division, which included Cadbury, became Mondelez International, a name that meant nothing to anyone and was designed to mean nothing. It was a corporate vessel, commercial entity optimized for global tax efficiency and operational flexibility. The Cadbury name survived as a subsidiary brand within this structure, printed on wrappers and stamped on Easter eggs, but the company that had built Bournville no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Decisions about Cadbury's products, workforce, and future were now made in Deerfield, Illinois, by executives whose connection to the brand extended no further than its contribution to quarterly earnings. The changes came steadily. In 2014, Mondelez altered the recipe for cream eggs, the seasonal chocolate that had been a British Easter staple for decades. The shell chocolate was changed from dairy milk to a cheaper standard cocoa mix. Consumers noticed immediately. The taste was different, the texture was wrong. The company denied any significant change. They then acknowledged it when the evidence became impossible to dismiss. Sales dropped. The backlash was fierce, sustained, and completely ignored by management in Illinois. The cream egg was a seasonal product generating specific revenue targets. If a cheaper recipe maintained acceptable sales volumes at higher margins, the reformulation was a success by the only metric that mattered to Mondelez. Consumer loyalty was someone else's problem. Then came dairy milk itself. Mondelez introduced palm oil and other cheaper fats into the recipe, replacing some of the cocoa butter that had given the bar its distinctive smoothness. The company described these as recipe improvements. Consumers described them differently. The chocolate tasted waxy. It melted wrong. It left a coating on the tongue that the original never had. Long-time Cadbury buyers stopped buying. Not all of them, not enough to threaten the brand's market dominance, but enough to erode something that no marketing campaign could rebuild. Trust. The implicit contract between Cadbury and its customers, the understanding that this company would never compromise on quality because quality was what the brand meant, had been broken by people who didn't understand what they were breaking. Here's the thing about shrinkflation. It's the corporate equivalent of picking someone's pocket while smiling at them. Mondelez reduced the size of dairy milk bars while maintaining or increasing prices. They redesigned packaging to disguise the reduction. A bar that had weighed 200 grams became 180, then 160. The Toblerone was reshaped in 2016, widening the gaps between its distinctive triangular peaks to reduce the amount of chocolate while keeping the box the same size. The visual change was so striking that it became a national talking point, a perfect symbol of corporate contempt for consumers who were expected to pay the same price for less product and not complain about it. Picture this. Walk into a British corner shop in 2020 and pick up a Cadbury dairy milk bar. The purple wrapper looks the same. The logo is the same. The glass-and-a-half promise is still printed on the packaging. But the bar is smaller than it was 10 years ago. The chocolate tastes different than it did 20 years ago. The company that made it no longer exists as an independent entity. The factory where it might have been produced has been closed or downsized, with the workers who might have made it have been replaced by cheaper labor in a different country. Everything that the wrapper promises, quality, heritage, trust, is a reference to something that is no longer true. The packaging is a ghost story printed in purple and gold. The workforce at Bournville contracted steadily under Mondelez ownership. The factory still operates, still produces chocolate, still employs local workers. But the scale is diminished. Departments that once employed hundreds now employ dozens. Production lines that ran 3 shifts operate on 1. The manufacturing jobs that George Cadbury created as the foundation of a moral community have been rationalized, automated, and outsourced to the point where Bournville is less a factory complex than a heritage site that happens to make some chocolate on the side. The workers who remain know they are employed at the pleasure of executives in Illinois who review their plant's efficiency metrics quarterly and compare them to facilities in Poland, India, and Brazil where the same work can be done for less money. Every quarterly review is a referendum on whether Bournville's continued operation is worth the premium that British wages and British regulations impose on production costs. So far, the answer has been yes. But so far is not the same as always, and the workers at Bournville understand the difference with a clarity that comes from watching colleagues lose their jobs one restructuring at a time. And then there is the question that hangs over every bar of Cadbury chocolate sold anywhere in the world. Where does the cocoa come from, and who picks it? The Cadbury family built their empire on the principle that every transaction should be fair, that exploitation was a sin against God, that the welfare of workers was not an expense to be minimized but an obligation to be honored. George Cadbury campaigned against sweated labor with the fury of a man who believed he would answer to his creator for every penny extracted from suffering. His newspaper exposed the conditions of workers in unregulated workshops and shamed Parliament into action. The moral architecture of Bournville was built on the conviction that no product is worth making if the people who make it are destroyed in the process. That conviction did not survive the transfer to American ownership. Mondelez sources cocoa from West Africa, primarily Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, where the industry has been plagued for decades by child labor, forced labor, and conditions that George Cadbury would have recognized instantly as the exact evils he spent his life fighting. Children as young as 5 work on cocoa farms, wielding machetes to harvest pods, carrying loads that damage their developing bodies, exposed to pesticides without protection. The scale is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of children work in cocoa production across West Africa. The chocolate industry, including Mondelez, has made repeated pledges to eliminate child labor from its supply chains. Those pledges have been made and broken with a regularity that makes Kraft's Summerdale promise look like a minor indiscretion. Deadlines set in 2001 were pushed to 2005, then 2008, then 2010, then 2020. Each deadline passed without resolution. Each new commitment was accompanied by press releases and sustainability reports that described progress in language calibrated to sound meaningful while committing to nothing enforceable. The gap between what Cadbury once stood for and what its supply chain actually produces is not a crack, it is a chasm. So what can we learn from this? Because the Cadbury story, like the Colt story before it, is not ancient history. It is a template that keeps repeating across industries, across borders, with the same devastating consequences for the same people who can least afford to absorb them. Lesson 1. Values without structural protection are just marketing. The Cadbury family believed deeply in fair dealing, honest conduct, and the moral responsibility of business. But they never built legal structures to protect those values from future owners who didn't share them. No dual-class share structures that would have given the family veto power over takeovers. No golden shares reserved for stakeholders committed to the company's founding principles. No constitutional protections written into the corporate charter. George Cadbury protected Bournville Village by placing it in an independent trust. He never did the same for the company itself. The village survived because it was legally shielded from corporate control. The company fell because it wasn't. Lesson 2. Going public means surrendering control to whoever holds the most shares. So the moment the Cadbury family allowed their company to be traded on public markets, they accepted that ownership would eventually pass to people who cared nothing about their values. Public markets are agnostic about purpose, they reward returns. A share of Cadbury stock held by a Quaker family member who cared about Bournville, and a share held by a hedge fund arbitrager betting on a takeover premium carried exactly the same voting rights. The family's moral authority counted for nothing once it was diluted below a controlling stake. Conscience without control is nostalgia. Lesson 3. Hostile takeovers reward short-term capital over long-term stakeholders. The Kraft acquisition was funded by debt, justified by cost synergies, and executed by investors who would hold the shares for months, not decades. The workers at Bournville and Summerdale, the communities that depended on those factories, the consumers who trusted the brand, none of them had a vote. The people with the shortest time horizon made the decision with the longest consequences. This is not a failure of capitalism. It is capitalism working exactly as designed. The system optimizes for whoever holds capital today, not for whoever bears the costs tomorrow. Lesson 4. Promises made during acquisitions have no enforcement mechanism. Kraft promised to keep Summerdale open. They broke the promise within weeks. No penalty was imposed. No legal consequence followed. The takeover panel, which regulated the financial conduct of the bid, had no authority over operational commitments. Parliament expressed outrage but had no power to compel compliance. The lesson is brutally simple. A promise made by a corporation during a takeover is worth exactly as much as the legal obligation behind it. If there is no contract, no penalty clause, no regulatory enforcement, the promise is decoration. It exists to facilitate the transaction and is discarded the moment it becomes inconvenient. Lesson 5. Heritage is not a defense. It is a selling point for the acquirer. Kraft didn't buy Cadbury despite its heritage. It bought Cadbury because of its heritage. The brand recognition, the consumer trust, the emotional connection that generations of British families felt toward the purple wrapper, these were the assets that made Cadbury worth £12 billion. Kraft paid for the accumulated goodwill of 2 centuries of Quaker values and then systematically extracted it. The recipes were cheapened. The workforce was reduced. The packaging was resized. Each change withdrew a small amount from the reservoir of trust that the Cadbury family had spent lifetimes filling. The acquirer doesn't preserve heritage. The acquirer monetizes it until the reservoir runs dry. Look at Bourneville one more time. The village green is still there. The houses still have their gardens. The Bourneville Village Trust still maintains the community that George Cadbury placed beyond corporate reach over a century ago. Children walk to schools that the chocolate money built. Families live in homes designed by a man who believed that fresh air and green space were as essential as wages. The trust endures because it was structurally protected. The company did not endure because it was not. That is the entire lesson of the Cadbury empire compressed into 2 sentences. What you protect survives. What you leave exposed gets taken. The chocolate still sells. The purple wrapper still lines shelves from London to Lagos. But the conscience that once filled that wrapper, the Quaker conviction that business existed to serve humanity rather than to extract from it, belongs to no one now. It was sold for 840 pence per share to people who had never heard of George Cadbury and would not have understood him if they had. The model village still stands. The moral architecture behind it is gone. And the chocolate, if you pay attention, does not taste the same.